Good. So we've been exploring different aspects of the monastic tradition of prayer, or the place of meditation in particular, in this monastic tradition. The word tradition, of course, is a dynamic word. It means transmission. It's not a museum where you look at finished works of art, but it's a process in which we are constantly receiving, adapting, and passing on. This is the very nature of the gospel, and a transmission of a living word, a living encounter, a living act. So it's in this sense that I'd like to speak about John Main as a contemporary figure within this ancient tradition. Just as a visual reminder of that, if you remember in the talk on Merton that Stefan gave today, there was a picture of his hermitage in the grounds of Gethsemane Abbey. Thomas Merton died in 1968. In 1976, John Main, so it was only 8 years after, 1976, John Main was invited by the abbot and the monks of Gethsemane Abbey to give some talks to the community. He had returned to London shortly before from a number of years as headmaster of St. Anselmo's monastic school in Washington, D.C. And he had returned to London, to his monastery at Ealing Abbey, to establish, first of all, a lay community within the monastery of young people, young men at that time, who would live for 6 months in the monastery, learning to meditate and sharing in the monastic life. At that point, we didn't, and I joined, that was my point of entry into the monastic life. At that point, we didn't integrate the meditation, the oratio pura, with the Opus Dei, with the office, but we would meditate in a separate house where we were living, and then we would walk over to join the monks for the office, for Mass, and for meals, of course. Then we spent the day working in the grounds or elsewhere in the monastery. So the monastic world had begun to hear about this, I suppose, and he was invited anyway by the abbot of Gethsemane to give some talks to the monks. And that was, in a sense, his first public teaching on meditation in the Christian tradition. And those talks were recorded, and years later I was told by guests staying at the monastery of Gethsemane that they were still playing these tapes in the guest refectory. They were published in a major monastic journal called Cistercian Studies, and then we published them. Actually, it was the first bit of editing and work that I did for him. We published them as a little booklet on our own called the Gethsemane Talks, Christian Meditation, the Gethsemane Talks. And they still remain that still is one of the most useful, simple, and attractive introductions to meditation in the tradition and in the way that he passed it on, transmitted it. Well, after he'd given these talks to the monastic community, he spent a few days in Merton's hermitage. And actually, quite recently, I was looking through some of his letters, and he wrote to a very dear friend of his called Rosie Lovett, and he said, "I've just celebrated the most loving Mass of my life here in Merton's hermitage." And this short few days spent in Merton's hermitage provided him with the experience and the discernment that he needed to make a very important decision, which was to whether or not to accept an invitation from the Archbishop of Montreal to go there and establish a Benedictine community that would be dedicated essentially to the teaching and the practice of meditation. And it was there in Merton's Hermitage that he came to that decision that he would do this. And he came back to England and eventually persuaded the abbot and the community of Ealing to agree to this. So Gethsemane was an interesting place, if you believe in synchronicity in tradition, that Merton, who had done so much to open up the Christian mind to its own contemplative tradition, but had not given a specific teaching on prayer that could be translated into the life of the ordinary Christian or the non-monastic Christian. It was here, nevertheless, that John Main made a very important decision. And similarly, actually, by a very strange coincidence, this only hit me a few years ago. In 1990, after I was about to go back, or had gone back to London, after several more years in Montreal after his death, I was giving a retreat at to the monks of Gethsemane, and it was there, and I spent a few days in the Hermitage as well, and it was immediately after that we had the great seminar at New Harmony, Indiana in 1991, at which the World Community for Christian Meditation was formed. It sort of was named and given a constitution and an organization. So if we just thinking about tradition as a transmission, the continuity points in a tradition are very significant and symbolic, and so I think it was quite moving, I think, for me to see that picture of the Hermitage in Stefan's presentation today. So John Main is clearly part of get the picture. An important contemporary part of the monastic tradition that we've been exploring this week. He had total conviction about the monastic archetype. This idea that there is a monk within each person is, I think, central to the relevance of monastic tradition, monastic culture, monastic teaching, theology, to the Christian life as a whole. If the monastic life was simply a specialized, eccentric form of life, there wouldn't be the same relevance to other forms of life. And but John Main, I think like many others, believe that there is deep within us, there are certain archetypes, certain fundamental, what should we say, orientations of our humanity. And one of these could be classified in Jungian terms, perhaps, as an archetype. And St. Benedict probably gives the simplest and most powerful definition of this archetype when he says, the monk is one who truly seeks God. That is the discernment. So there is something within each of us that truly, not just superficially, not just occasionally, but truly and continually seeks God, wholeness, the source, our origin and our destination. So John Main had a conviction about this monastic, the universality of this monastic archetype, and the value of monasticism to the modern world. And this grew with time and through his own experience. And I'd like to give you a little overview of his life to humanize some of these ideas. that of course he wasn't, when he was born in 1926, he didn't say, know he was going to become a monk, and he didn't know that his great contribution to the world would be a teaching on this aspect of monastic prayer. He had no illusions about the failures of contemporary monasticism. Like John Cassian and Germanus, when they went to Bethlehem and found the life there was not sufficiently deep or helpful in their seeking God, and so they went from there to the Egyptian desert. And as Merton himself, increasingly during his life as a monk, wrote critically, sometimes almost very rudely, about the failures of monasticism, monastic life as it was lived. And I think Bede Griffiths himself, who went after 20 years as a monk in England, went to India to find the other half of his soul, as he said. Now, these figures, these monastic figures, believed in monasticism, they believed in the universality of the monastic archetype, but they were very clear about the contemporary weaknesses and failures of monastic institutions and of monastic leadership. And John Main suffered this as well. He was frustrated with the inertia and the complacency of some aspects of this institutional life and of the complacency, as I said, of a tradition that was too weighed down by its own institutionalism. And I think this is an important characteristic of John Main's vision, and this would apply to those other monastic leaders or prophets I mentioned, is to be able to see the distinction between tradition and institution. None of these were anti-institutional figures. They weren't anarchic. They were monks. They were trained to live in a rather hierarchical and highly organized form of life. It doesn't suit everybody. Drives some people crazy to have to live in a timetable, and some of you might have loved these last few days living in the rhythm of monastic life, but you say, my God, I couldn't live like this forever. Other people, it is liberating and joyful to do it. So these figures, and John Main in particular, loved the monastic rhythm of life and accepted and saw the value of the institutional structures and even the hierarchy of obedience and so on, which is not for everybody. But they were frustrated, and he was frustrated, both by personal temperament and as a visionary and as a reformer, with the way the tradition that should be carried by the institution was often weighed down by the institution. And I think this reflects very much that those insights that Sarah shared with us the other day when she was talking about liturgy and the church. Nevertheless, he always believed in it. He believed in keeping the tradition in, or at least connected to, organically connected to the institution. This was why when he did make that decision to leave the comfortable, as it were, institution of his monastery in London and go and start a completely new experiment in Canada at that time, it was very important for him to carry this idea forward within the institution and get the permission of the abbot and the council, and it took him a couple of attempts to do that, but he was a persuasive individual, and he carried this idea over, but he carried it over within the institution. Let's just look a little bit at his life. I've got some photos here, which are from the website, WCCM website. This was a picture I took of John Main in would have been in probably late November 1982. He died on December the 30th, 82. This is our new website, isn't it? Which is going to be launched very soon. A new version of the website. Okay, so here, these are the oldest pictures, are they? What? So the right hand click? Okay. Okay, well, this is not what I wanted. What did I say? Let's just go back. Why can't I go back here? Okay. Okay, here's the earliest known photograph of John Main, future monastic prophet. I think this is him here. He's fair-haired. Okay, then he was born in London in 1926. His Irish parents, from the family roots were in Ballinskelligs, County Kerry in Ireland. His grandfather, Douglas Main, John Main's baptismal name was Douglas. His grandfather had been an engineer working for Marconi and had come from Scotland. And he'd come to Ballinskelligs as it was the point where the first transatlantic telephone cable came from the States and touched European soil. And it was there that not only did the cable touch Irish soil, but his grandfather's heart was touched by a young girl in the village. And so that was the connection. So he was Celtic on both sides, Irish and Scottish, but he was born in London in 1926, educated by the Jesuits at Stamford School. So these are some pictures of the family. That would be his father's, some kind of holiday. He had, this is him, I don't know how old he would have been then, 3 or 4 maybe? Less? Looking a little proper. He was a chorister at Westminster Choir School and had a very, very good voice and used to sing. And just actually shortly before he died, he had a kind of a flashback, very powerful flashback to his days singing at Westminster Cathedral. So again, then they would go back to Ireland occasionally for holidays, but was really brought up in England. And this is his family. And he was very close to his family. They were a strong, loving family, very humorous, very slightly wild, and enjoyed each other's company immensely and remained very close always. So this would have been, I think, just after he left school. This was, immediately he left school, he became a trainee journalist on a London paper, and this was his identity, his press card. So he used to do all sorts of reports, like writing reports on concerts or football matches, things, whatever they needed. Then the war came, and I think 1943 he joined the Royal Signals and was attached to a unit that interestingly went ahead of the advancing Allied troops in occupied Europe. And the job of his particular group of soldiers was to identify to identify enemy positions where they were sending out signals. And he said the work of trying to identify where the signals were coming from and then getting in there was greatly helped by the invention of the quartz crystal, which you put in and it makes it much easier to identify where the signal is coming from. And he used this image much later in his life when he was writing about prayer to describe how we get onto the wavelength of the mind of Christ. We pick up this signal and tune ourselves into it. So it's a contemporary use of a metaphor to describe prayer. And just as another example of how tradition gets misunderstood, probably about 20 years ago, when we were starting to teach meditation in Brazil, there was a monk, rather eccentric monk, in a monastery there, who was attacking Christian meditation. But he was attacking everything, actually, new, or that he thought was new. But he was attacking this, and he said, this is John Main's teaching is all New Age. Meditation is New Age. So eventually we had a talk. He wouldn't talk about it at first, and he was difficult to talk with. But eventually we did get to talk, and I said, now what exactly do you mean by New Age, and why is John Main New Age? Because if you read Word into Silence, his first book, you'll see it's very much a Trinitarian theology. It's very traditional theology. He said, no, it's all New Age. I said, so explain why. He talks about quartz crystals and uses crystals in order to get to higher states of consciousness. You know. So I said, have you actually read this thing? Yes, I did read it. So I handed him the relevant passage, and he said, oh, well, anyway. So tradition can be misinterpreted. So here, this is his sister Yvonne with some of her children, and shortly before he became a monk, when he was, I'll fill in the gaps in a minute, he was living in Dublin and helping to raise her children because her husband had died. And he was a very good uncle and had a very wonderful relationship with children who loved him as a storyteller and somebody to play with. Okay, this is him here. This would have been about 1955, I suppose. I'm leaping ahead now, so maybe I should pick up the story. This is when he was a professor of international law at Trinity College in Dublin. So, okay, he's in the war. He survives the war. Was wounded in an explosion and hurt his back, but which occasionally I was once in a restaurant with him, I think in Belgium. We were actually going to see some old ladies who had sheltered him and his fellow soldiers during the war. And he was, his back froze and he couldn't move for about half an hour. So he had some war damage. But after the war, he came back, of course, to England, and he joined the Canons Regular of the Lateran and spent a year as a novice down in Cornwall, and then was sent to Rome to study. And this would have been 1946, 47. And I think I once actually came, when I was in Rome with him once, we went to see his former novice master, who at that point was the head of the order. And he didn't have the happiest memories of that period. He found it very repressive. It was the kind of church, the kind of religious life that he came to really renounce and reject, and felt was dehumanizing. And but he stuck it out and for some time, and then finally realized that it wasn't for him. So he left and came back to London and his sister told the story. You know, with the family you can't always be sure the stories are true, that when he arrived at her flat in London, straight from Rome, he took out his habit, which he'd brought with him, and threw it down the garbage chute of the apartment building. He said, "Now that's all finished now." So he was a strong person and a strong-minded. So then he studied law at Trinity College in Dublin, and then he decided to travel. He joined the British Foreign Service and went to study Chinese at the School of Oriental and African Studies in London. And then he was sent to Malaysia, to Kuala Lumpur, which then was in a state of insurgency, fighting the communists. And it was there he was attached to the Governor General's office and as a Chinese translator. But he continued to study Chinese. And it was there on one day that he was sent on a sort of little diplomatic mission to a place called the Pure Life Society, which I know some of you have been to, which was then some way outside of Kuala Lumpur. Now it's in the busy suburbs of it. And he was asked to go to visit an Indian monk, Tamil monk, called Swami Satyananda, who the British had made a Justice of the Peace for his work in bringing about reconciliation among the different racial groups in Malaysia. And then also he had started this Pure Life Society, which included an orphanage for children who were victims of the war. And he was bringing up children from different religious and racial backgrounds in a spirit of harmony, Muslims, Hindus, and I think Muslim Hinduism. So then he went out to visit this monk and delivered his message and thanks and a letter. And then the conversation became a little more free, and they began to talk about the spiritual basis of this monk's life and work. And he began to realize that he was in the presence of a very holy man, a man of deep interiority and deep inner life, as well as a man very generously and creatively involved in social work. And so the conversation moved on to prayer, and the monk asked him, "Are you a prayerful man, Mr. Mayne, a religious man?" He said, "Yes, I am. I pray. I'm a Catholic." He said, in fact, I go to Mass every day, and I pray." And the monk said, "Well, how do you pray?" Probably a very important question in the history of this tradition. And John Mayne, or Douglas Mayne as he was then, explained how he prayed, and he described basically the kind of mental prayer that he would have learnt, and most of us here would have learnt as children. Remember, he was educated by the Jesuits. And he described this once as the prayer of contrition, thanksgiving, and supplication, CTS, Catholic Truth Society. So basically those forms of prayer, liturgical and mental prayer and devotional prayer. And the monk listened to this very respectfully and said, "It's wonderful to meet a man of spirituality." But then he began to speak about his own understanding of the prayer of the heart, which he called meditation. And he described in a verse from the Upanishads that struck Father John very deeply, that the spirit of the one who created the universe dwells within the human heart and in silence is loving to all. The spirit of the one who creates the universe dwells within the human heart and in silence is loving to all. Now, John Mayne was deeply moved by these words, partly because they resonated with his own Christian faith, the Creator and the indwelling of the Spirit, and also because he felt these words were being spoken by someone who knew the meaning of them, who had lived the meaning of them. So they spoke a little bit more, and the monk explained how, in their way of meditation, they would move from the head to the heart, letting go of thoughts, words, and imagination, and coming into the silence, the stillness of the heart. And that they did this with a very simple practice of repeating a word or verse continually during the time of the meditation. And again, John Main was struck deeply by this in two ways, partly because of the authenticity with which the monk was speaking, and partly because it resonated with his own tradition of interior prayer, repetitive prayer, the rosary, and other forms of repetition as a way of coming to deeper prayer. But at the same time, he knew it was something different. There was a radical simplicity here that he hadn't encountered before, and a clarity of a discipline. And so he said to the monk, well, as I told you, I'm a Christian. Could you teach me to meditate? And the monk said, well, of course, you'll be a better Christian if you do it. So he agreed, but he said, I can only teach you on one condition, and that is if you're serious about it. I think he felt, he was a busy man. He wasn't going to waste his time on somebody who was just, going to waste his time. So John Main said, well, what do you mean by serious? He said, well, by serious, I mean that you will meditate every day, in the morning for half an hour, and in the evening for half an hour. And he said, that's all you really need to do. But you can come and meditate with me once a week, and if you have any questions, I'll be happy to discuss them, answer them, or whatever. So for about 2 years, a little less than 2 years, this is what John Main did. He was a very disciplined person in his personal life, and organized, and that's probably why he liked monastic life, because it was very regular, and he was a regular kind of guy. So he introduced meditation into his life, and once a week he would go and meditate with his teacher. And in the Gethsemane talks, those talks he gave at the Abbey of Gethsemane, he said that he would sometimes ask the monk, so how long is this going to take? And the monk would just smile at him. Or he'd say, fine, now what's going to happen next? And the monk would just say your mantra. And in a talk that John Main gave shortly before he died, and we've collected all these talks that he gave over about a 5-year period, the collected talks of John Main on CDs, he remembers this very early introduction to meditation. And he says on this talk, he said, these are probably the most useful and wisest words I've ever heard about prayer. Say your mantra. So then, very much enriched in his spiritual life, John Main returned to England. I think he wasn't all that excited about working for the British Empire, being an Irishman at heart, but he returned to England, in fact returned to Ireland, and went back to his university where he'd studied law, and was appointed professor of international law very soon afterwards. And he enjoyed university life. He enjoyed being close to his family, helping to raise his sister's children, and he being very organized and also a lover of life. He said he would, maybe exaggerating a little bit, he said he would do all his university work by 10 o'clock in the morning, and then devoted himself to pleasure, like going to the races, and he loved concerts and walking, and he loved life very much. And I think this love of life is the key to understanding why he became a monk, and very much tunes in with what Guidalberto was saying a couple of days ago about asceticism. Asceticism as a celebration of life rather than as a form of punishment or sort of depressive negativity or self-laceration. Okay. So, where are we now? So here he is in Washington, in Dublin, Trinity College, Dublin. He was also called to the bar. He didn't practice at the bar, but he was a barrister. Gray's Inn. And then, in 1958, he joined the Benedictine monastery of Ealing Abbey in London. This is his first Mass, and giving communion to his mother. So what led him to become a monk? He said that it was clearly from his early, as a very young man after the war, he felt a call to religious life of some kind, and didn't find it in the form that he first entered it. But the seed of that calling, of vocation, was there. But what generated it probably was in the death of a nephew of his, a young boy of 12, who was suffering from a brain tumor. And he accompanied the boy and his sister, the boy's mother, and the family during very traumatic and painful illness. And I think as a result of that, he was sent back to the very deep questions of the meaning of life. When you, with a child who dies at the age of 12, you ask, what is the meaning of life? And this led him to become a monk. And I think you can see in the course of his life is this quality of being able to make radical changes in his life at moments where everything was going well, when things were really flourishing and he was successful. You know, these are usually the transition moments, these are usually the moments in life where you don't want transitions to happen. You just want to enjoy your good luck or your success for as long as possible. But these were characteristically for him the times where he would take this leap to everyone's surprise. Maybe he even enjoyed surprising people, but this was his genius, really, and I think it accounted for the speed and the direction of his seeking God. So he came to Ealing and still meditating, integrating the meditation into his daily life and daily Mass. And when he came to the monastery, he looked forward to the opportunity to speak about this with a Christian monk. And when he spoke about his prayer life with his novice master, he was a little disappointed, to put it mildly, when the monk told him, well, I don't think this is a Christian way of prayer that you're doing. So, but maybe God had some plan in using it to bring you to the monastery, but now you should give it up. So that's not what he was expecting to hear. So this was 1958, remember, this was even before the Beatles started to meditate. So meditation was very much associated in the Christian mind with something oriental and non-Christian. So, in obedience, he did this. He gave up meditation. And in the Gethsemane talks, he describes how this was like the beginning of a desert, in a desert. But he was a positive and joyful man, and he, of course, continued to pray in the other ways. And prayer was always a major part, the center of his life. And as a monk, he prayed in different forms, and he loved all these different forms of prayer. But he had lost this prayer of the heart, and which he had learned in the East. But he hadn't yet got the means to connect it to his own Christian tradition. So then he came here to Sant Anselmo in Rome to study theology. so this is actually before this picture, but not long before. Oh no, I thought we had some pictures of him in, I think they're out of sequence. Wait a second. Sorry about this. No, I told them to put these in the right sequence. Okay, so let's forget that a minute. All right, so anyway, he came to study here in Rome. He was here during the heady days of the beginning of the Vatican Council. He was very enthusiastic about the changes taking place in the mind and mentality of the church, and has some very interesting stories about that period. And he loved Rome. He loved the community. This San Anselmo at that time would have been filled with young monks sent here for kind of advanced study from all over the world, so he could see monasticism as a global movement, global culture, and so on. So he was there just, at the heyday, really. And then he returned to England, was ordained, and actually just before he was ordained was when I first met him. I was a boy in the school at St. Benedict's, and we were told that there was a new religion teacher going to take us at the beginning of the term. And we had destroyed our previous religion teacher, given him a nervous breakdown. And so we were looking forward to doing the same with this new teacher who was called Brother John. So he was only a brother, so we could really do what we liked with him. And but as soon as he walked into the room, we could see that this was a man of great self-possession, confidence, and if he'd been able to deal with insurgent communists in the Malaysian jungle, he'd be able to deal with a few schoolboys in West London. So, and his gift, I think, for teaching children was, as he said, to treat them as if they are adults, but never forget that they're children. So we came to really respect him because we felt he respected us, and he was a good teacher. That was actually the only time he taught me during my school years. So then he was ordained. He became the deputy headmaster of the school immediately, and he was there in the background of my school years. I had a few disciplinary run-ins with him, and then in 1969, he was sent to St. Anselmo's Abbey in Washington, D.C. And he was sent there to do some study. There have been various things going on. But he very quickly was asked to become headmaster of the school. And he took over the school, as he said rather dramatically. He said, the monks were all leaving to get married. Nobody else was getting married in those days, but except monks wanted to get married. The boys were all smoking pot or, running wild. And he brought, and there was a financial crisis. He brought things into order and became a very successful headmaster and a successful figure in the Catholic American educational world. And then one day the abbot said to him, "John, we have a young man, a student who's just come back from the East. He's been staying in ashrams and Buddhist monasteries, and he's full of stuff about meditation. Could you speak with him? Because he's asking, is there anything like this in Christianity?" So Father John met with him and listened to this young man who was truly seeking God and trying to seek God at that depth of experience that had been opened up for him by his exposure to the contemplative wisdom of the East. And that was a turning point, a second great turning point for John Main. Because in wanting to guide this young seeker respectfully and at the same level of depth, he was led back to study the roots of his own tradition. And the first point of call on this search into his own tradition was Augustine Baker, the great 17th century English Benedictine. And in Augustine Baker, he read about the prayer aspirations, repeated prayers that would be form part of the inner life of the monk and of other Christians. And Baker refers back to Cassian as the origin of this form of aspiratory prayer. And so John Main went back to Cassian, to the 9th and 10th conference of Cassian, and there in the 10th conference, which I spoke about a few days ago, he now remembered and recognized the same method of prayer, the prayer of the heart, the mantra. Cassian calls it the formula that he had learnt some years before when he was in Malaysia in the East. Now that was as I think you may have the impression already, John Main had a quick mind and also a decisive mind. Once he had seen something, he acted on it. He could wait for a long time patiently, but when he saw it, he acted. And so he began to meditate again himself. And I actually went out to see him just about this time on some personal business. And so he was now meditating again, and he would walk back from the monastery, or from the school where he was headmaster, back to the monastery at midday for the midday office and to meditate. So he was now meditating 3 times a day, in the morning before the morning prayer, midday, and in the evening before Vespers or after Vespers. And so I had the good fortune to go to speak with him at this time, and it was in one of those conversations that he spoke to me about meditation, quite unexpectedly. And what he said made a huge impact on me. He didn't give a long talk about it, he just spoke about meditation in a few light words. And this is how I think tradition happens. Just sort of a very light touch at the right moment. It's all the question of timing, isn't it? Timing and receptivity. So at that moment it hit me hard, but I didn't understand what he was saying. Intellectually, it made no sense to me at all. I was on a spiritual quest, I was on an intellectual quest for spiritual truth, but I didn't understand. It didn't seem to make any sense to let go of your thoughts, words, and images. I didn't know what that meant. But at the other level of my heart, I knew that what he was saying was totally authentic and true. And not only that, but it awakened in me something new that I hadn't felt before, and I think this is something all of you can identify with. That was a longing, a hunger for the experience of this new revelation, of what this meant in our own experience. And that's a phrase that John Main came to use characteristically in all of his teaching. And I think this sets him aside, from other, I'm not saying he's better or worse, but it sets him in a different category from many other monastic teachers of this period, because he was not only describing what he saw. In fact, he recognized that what you see, what you experience, what you find out through meditation is really impossible to put into words. You can use poetry, you can use photographs, you can use theology, you can use all sorts of ways of expression to try to express it, but ultimately that's not the point. So you will not find long, beautiful descriptions of states of prayer in John Main. What you will find is a very persuasive presentation of a tradition and of a conviction that meditation is something that is universal and that we enter into in your own experience. That's his phrase. In your own experience. And this takes you right back to the heart of the 10th Conference of Cassian. Cassian says, Magistra experientia. Experience is the teacher. If you don't do it, you won't understand it. And isn't that what the Swami said to him? I can only teach you if you do it, if you open yourself to this experience. And isn't that what we say today to people who come to meditation groups or retreats and so on? We have to do it, experience it in order to know it. So he stayed in Washington for another few years. Now meditation was becoming more and more powerfully the center of his life and the meaning of his own monastic journey. And so he was now at another very successful moment in his life. The school was flourishing, he was getting accolades and compliments everywhere, and then he resigned. And so I want to go back to his home monastery in London, and he came back and persuaded or offered the idea to the abbot and the community of setting aside one of the houses on the grounds as a house for a group of young laymen who would come and live for 6 months, sharing in the life of the monastery, but also developing their own practice of meditation in a disciplined way and meditating 3 times a day. And I went to see him. I was working, or just leaving working a job at an investment bank at the time, and I went to see him on a cold January evening, and he was sitting alone. He was alone in this house because it hadn't opened yet, and he was telling me his vision, what it was about, and I could, again, not fully understand it, but this seemed to connect with that hunger that I had awakened some years before when I heard about meditation. So I thought, well, okay, I'm changing my job, I can take 6 months and come and learn to meditate finally, because I wasn't doing any meditation. And he was a little bit discouraging, and he probably thought I wasn't ready for it. And but anyway, I joined, and it was a very unique experience of monastic living, parallel to the institutional form of the monastic life, which lacked meditation. Some of the monks came over and meditated with us occasionally, but not very often. But they supported it, thought it was a good thing, and they all hoped that we would be vocations, to that form of monastic life. The only one was me. And I didn't stay very long in that particular monastery. But anyway, it was a transformative experience, because at this level where we were also living the tradition. So you had the institution and the tradition sort of in parallel, but that creates some tension. Institutions can be very suspicious of tradition. They don't mind their own traditions, their own customs, their own habits, but tradition itself can be quite threatening to institutional life. So there were inevitable complications there. And then, as I said, he received an invitation to start a new form of Benedictine monastic life, integrating meditation with the office, the Mass, the prayer, and also making the teaching of meditation central to the life and the work of the monastery. So it was the work of the monastery, was not to run a school, not to run a parish, not to make chocolates, or even to write books, but to teach in meditation. So in September 1977, the abbot of Ealing drove us to Heathrow, and we took a plane to Montreal. We got out of Montreal, pouring rain. The Bishop of Montreal was there to greet us and drove us to what was to become our first monastery in this experiment. And it was the whole of the monastic institution cut back to its roots, cut back to its very roots, pruned to its essentials. Because in the first house we didn't even wear the habit, except on special occasions, because it just wasn't appropriate. But the essence of the life was there. The integration of the Opus Dei with the Oratio Pura, and the work was and the hospitality. We didn't have any guest rooms. We had some of the lay community from London came out to join us. Monks from other parts of North America began to visit us. The abbot primate here from Rome came out to see him and invited him actually to start a new Benedictine congregation, which he would have done if he had lived longer. So, but it was quite new and difficult to categorize, difficult to pigeonhole. But it was respected, and John Main's genius, really, and his courage, his prophetic insight was very, very powerful. Then in 1980, he was diagnosed with colon cancer, and all the evidence was that it had been caught very quickly in time, but it returned in the beginning of 1982 and then metastasized, and he died in December of 1982. So let's just finish. This was the part of the lay community at Ealing. That's me, just after I'd taken the habit. This was the great scripture scholar Bernard Orchard. This was one of the young monks, and these are this is an American student, and this is a boy from the school. That's at Ealing again. This would have been probably during his time in Washington. This was in his room at Ealing. And this is in Montreal with the bishop who invited him there, the visionary man called Bishop Crowley. And this was some of the young monastic candidates at the larger house in Montreal that we were given. We started our first meditation group for children here in Montreal. This young man here is now a professor of international affairs at Concordia University in Canada. This was Rome, so this is all out of sequence. So this is in Rome. What church is that? Anybody recognize it? St. John Lateran, okay. So this is him, and would have been about 1960, I think. This was shortly before, this was the last summer holiday in Nova Scotia before he died. No, this is all out of sequence. This was after his first operation. It's all out of sequence. So this is, this would have been after, if you see him wearing a beard, it's after his operation, because he stopped shaving after his first operation. This is with his sister. This is writing during that holiday in Nova Scotia. Now this is the large house we were given in Montreal at the time, And this is an oblate, this is a gathering of the oblates. Very important part of his vision of monastic life was the oblates. And he realized that these were people who were truly seeking God, practicing meditation on a daily basis, and inspired by the rule of Saint Benedict. So, this is gone now. Okay, these are some of the last photos of him. Okay. So it's a little, I wanted you just to have a sense of the man and of the life. I'll more briefly speak about the monastic roots of his teaching on meditation. I mentioned Cassian, the Cloud of Unknowing, Augustine Baker, John Chapman, the Abbot of Downside, all of whom speak about this monologistos prayer, the prayer of one word. And also, I think it's this monastic ambience of the tradition that influences the way he teaches. He teaches meditation as a discipline, as an ascetical discipline, the transcending of the ego. And in the asceticism in the sense that we heard about it the other day. He's emphasizes the simplicity of this teaching, but also that it's not easy. And because it's not easy, we need community to help us to persevere with it, to learn. It's a learning process, he says. And fortunately, the meditation experience itself creates the community that allows you to grow and persevere with it. It's also obediential. For St. Benedict, obedience is the primary vow, not just in the sense of doing what you're told in an institutional way, but in listening. The word obedience means to listen deeply to the Word of God. So for him, meditation is the total obedience of the whole self, the whole person. And listening to the mantra is what brings us into this state of complete synchronizing with the wavelength or the quartz crystal of the prayer of Christ. And another aspect of the monastic quality of his teaching is the daily discipline of the meditation. In the monastery, we're used to the idea that you should go to all the offices. John Main translates that into the daily regularity of meditation. Integrate the meditation with your other forms of prayer, but do it morning and evening. His theology of prayer, which you'll find in his books and in his talks, prayer is transformation. It's the transformation of our mind and heart, the integration of mind and heart. It doesn't replace other forms of prayer, but it brings these other forms of prayer into clarity and into deep meaning. After he had started to meditate in Washington again, he reread the New Testament and the scriptures, and he read them hungrily and attentively and reacted very freshly to them, and particularly to the letters of St. Paul. And it was in St. Paul that he hears about the mystery of Christ in you, the indwelling Christ. We do not know how to pray, but the Spirit prays within us deeper than words. So all of this became, as it did for Cassian. Remember what Cassian says. He knew that meditation was working on him because he was reading the scriptures from his own experience. He knew experientially what the scriptures were meaning. One of the key words in John Main's vocabulary is experience, and it's very important to understand what he means by that. Not experiences, things that happen in meditation, highs you get, or consolations you get, or visions that you get, or something happening. By experience, he means an entering into the bigger, deeper, broader indeed cosmic experience of Christ. Not just my own little experience, oh, I had a great meditation this morning, but into the transformative experience of Christ. It is not our prayer, but the prayer of Jesus. And this is exactly what Cardinal Newman refers to. This is Newman's great idea as well, is that in the Christian life we move beyond notional assent, what Newman calls notional assent. So believing all these things with our heads, but not actually experiencing them. Newman uses the word real in his vocabulary. John Main used experience. John Main also believed in that theology of meditation that a personal change takes place. We see life not in terms of limitation, but in terms of potential, expansion. He's a fundamentally joyful person. And also, in one sense, he's rooted in the Orthodox understanding that it is the resurrection, even more than the crucifixion. You can't separate them, obviously, but it is his starting point is the resurrection, whereas in so much of Western Christianity, Latin Christianity, our starting point and often our ending point is the crucifixion. So his meditation had, as it were, given him a new center of theology, which was resurrection. And he saw the cross. He understood the cross. He suffered the cross himself. But he understood the cross in the light of the resurrection. And that's why I think, we can see the teaching of meditation as a form of evangelization. And maybe today, an essential form of evangelization. How else are we going to get this across, what Sarah was saying the other day? How are we going to get this across to people? Except through the experience of personal transformation, which leads to community and to a new understanding of the relationship between the church and the world. John Main was a churchman. He loved the church. He was desperately frustrated with it, but also believed in it, and believed that it needed to be renewed, reformed, and set free from this institutional weight that had descended upon it. And as I said at the beginning, and I'll finish here, he was a monk. He loved being a monk, and this, although his form of monastic life changed, as mine did, and but that only brought him into a deeper experience of the monastic archetype in his own personal story. He saw being a monk as a liberation, as a joyful liberation, and as a grace. Now, there are many forms of grace in your life, such as marriage or having children, or building a major multinational corporation. All of those might be joyful and grace-filled experiences. Sometimes you can't put them all into one life. But for him, the monastic life was a grace, a gift. And his way of expressing that was as a community of love, the title of one of the collection of some of his essays and works. And for him, community of love, and this is what brought me into monastic life, because of the way it inspired me, that the whole purpose of the monastic experience is to create these centers of dynamic love, in which the members draw each other out into the fullness of their own personal being. Not easy. He never said it was easy, but he always saw the joyfulness of it. And it was in this sense that he spoke about meditation and indeed the whole Christian life as a transcendence of the ego. I just want to end with, I'd just like to show you some of his books, first of all. I think there don't seem to be many of them left on the table outside, but what? Oh, here he is in Montreal, 1980, when the Dalai Lama came to visit the little house we had. This, I don't know who this person is, but I don't know what he's doing there at all. So here's the book, Community of Love. Those of you who know Kim will recognize Kim's back here. Kim Nataraja. Second. All of these you'll find on the website. This is the daily readings, one of the most popular books of John Main, edited by Paul Harris in Canada. Door to Silence, collection of his talks. This is a little biography of John Main by Paul Harris. A book about John Main by people who knew him. An anthology, The Essential Writings of John Main, put out by Orbis. This is a book, actually this one here, called The Expanding Vision. Sarah has a chapter in it, and it was a seminar that, for the 25th anniversary of his death. This is a little anthology of his sayings. This is the last book that he published in his lifetime, and the foreword to this book is one of the most succinct. It's only about two or three pages, but he describes his whole understanding of the journey of meditation in that. This is a collection of his newsletters, Monastery Without Walls. Another book of his teachings, short teachings. Like the Desert Fathers, he didn't write long books. This is a systematic anthology of John Main put together by Peter Ng in Singapore, who was a very systematic thinker. And he did great service, really, to John Main by putting that book together. Now, here's a little book of his sayings that we use now to bring meditation to business people, MBA students, to doctors and teachers in secular environments, where sometimes you're not allowed to use the word God or any religious language. But by selectively choosing some of his sayings, we were able to bring his teaching into the secular world. This was his first book, Word into Silence, which is his basic theology of the Trinitarian theology of Christian meditation. Another one, Word Made Flesh. And these are the collected talks, which you can now get. We've enhanced the digital quality of them now. They're all online as well. So you can... yes. Now, this is thank you. This is very good. Each of these now each of these CD set corresponds to one of the books, the talks given in the books. Okay, so this is where you can actually download all these talks. And actually, from what I've said, you probably can see the point of saying that this is an oral tradition. The gospel is an oral tradition. It doesn't matter how many books you write. At the end of the day, what is transmitted in this tradition is person to person, heart to heart, eye contact to eye contact, physical being with physical being. And now, obviously, we need the media, we need the internet, we need books, we need all these forms to help us to do that. But I think if every one of us were to look into our own journey, we'd be able to identify key moments where this personal one-to-one encounter took place. That's why community is so central to the monastic life and to the teaching. I won't read this, but there's a chapter in this book, The Expanding Vision, which is an article, Reflections on Christian Meditation, from John Cassian to John Main, by Adalbert de Vogüé. Adalbert de Vogüé was a great, very great monastic scholar of the, he died, French scholar, died a few years ago. And this is a very thoughtful, nuanced appreciation of John Main's place in the historical monastic tradition. And he says something, and this is a very traditional scholar speaking, but so traditional that he's radical. He sees that what John Main is doing in terms of Benedictine tradition, and not all Benedictine monks would agree with this, but John Main returned to a source of the rule, that's the Cassian, to supply for a lacuna, a gap, something missing in the rule, which is left open or imperfectly filled by those who make use of it. So John Main, by going back to Cassian, who is a source of the rule, is able in contemporary form of the tradition to supply a gap in the rule. And that gap is not entirely a gap because but Benedict points to Cassian. But it is effectively a gap in the rule. The absence of a method of contemplative prayer corresponding, as Adalbert de Vogüé says, corresponding to the Jesus prayer of the Orthodox Church. We didn't have it. We had the Rosary. For some people, that's perfectly useful, good, sacred. But we didn't have in the Latin Church a form of the prayer of the heart, a method of the prayer of the heart corresponding to the Jesus prayer of the Orthodox Church. So, if in terms of the tradition and a scholar's view of the tradition, you might like to read that chapter in The Expanding Vision by Adalbert de Vogüé. So, that's John Main, his life, his teaching, and I think an influence which remains very potent in the life of the monastic tradition. So thank you.